It ends up that I get this opportunity to speak on the 100th anniversary of Thurgood Marshall's birthday, which literally to the day, which to me is always these amazing events in life that happen. And so that makes it a very, very special honor for me to be here and have this opportunity to talk about Citizen Marshall and Justice Jackson. This is also a bicentennial year for the abolition of slavery, and that's an important aspect of this presentation I'm going to do here, because in many ways what was Marshall doing and what was Jackson doing is trying to deal with some of the legacies of slavery in the period when they intersected there in the 40s and 50s. The other thing about this year is it's the 60th anniversary of a case called Ada Sipwell versus University of Oklahoma. And that has special meaning for me because my dad was working as a stringer for Ebony magazine, well, actually the roving editor at the time, taking photos for them. And he was on his way actually to Nat King Cole's honeymoon in Guadalajara, and he got a call saying, "You need to go to Norman, Oklahoma. There's a big case." So he went over there and ended up being in the courtroom and took a couple of shots. And one of the ones, this one that I've got here that we'll talk about in the course of the presentation. Here, that's Ada Sipwell, who was from Oklahoma, Chickasaw, Oklahoma. She wanted to go to the University of Oklahoma Law School, and as the system was back then, I'll tell you more about it, she just decided at the time if a Negro wanted to go to the law school, basically the way it worked in places of segregation is they could go to school outside the state. They couldn't go to the local segregated law school at the University of Oklahoma, etc. But that's where she wanted to go to school. So the case there in Norman, Oklahoma. And then next to Thurgood Marshall is a gentleman who is a question of people have, I mean, you can go back and look in the record, but I prefer to leave it a mystery as to who he is. And then the last thing I'm going to do in this presentation is look at these two men as men of their times, to contrast sort of the vision of that time focused on civil rights. I would end it with the last part, which is talking about civil rights and human rights. Both of these men are men of their time, just like all of us are people of our time. One of the things about that time is that in these decisions, you never hear a discussion of sort of international law. Another thing I teach, you never hear about human rights. You never hear about that kind of language, because the language really didn't exist. It started in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It went on from there. There are other covenants, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. All of these international instruments started to play out where what happened is that states were recognizing on the international plane they had obligations that were rights that inured to the benefit of human beings because they are human. Not because they're a citizen or a non-citizen or anything, but just these are rights you have as a human. Now, what does that mean if you can't enforce it? Yes, everyone understands the problem in enforcing it. But the key thing is that the idea of just having rights, not because you're an American citizen or under the Constitution, but just because you're a human being, really didn't start to crystallize until after that. Nuremberg was part of that. And the human rights movement that we had the last 50-odd years or so. One of the things, and I'll finish up with this, is I had an opportunity to sit in at the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination hearings on the U.S. periodic report, looking at sort of how has the U.S. moved towards complying with its obligations under that convention itself to eliminate racial discrimination. And one of the fascinating things about that discussion was you had people from around the world saying, look, the United States is kind of the image of where we're all going to be. Europe is getting to be multicolored, multiracial. Out in Asia, that's happening. All of these different places that are happening. So how the U.S. does it is very important to us. In Brazil, how they're going to deal with all the different groups of people there. And so it's very important for them to see how the U.S. did it. Marshall, through his cases and through his legal act, set the legal foundations for a lot of what happened. But at this meeting in Geneva, one of the comments they made is we take too legalistic an attitude towards the obligation under the treaty. That maybe our vision should not be much broader than just a legalistic attitude, sort of pulling the social justice side, maybe pulling something that we might have heard in Martin Luther King, for example, in that sort of social movement approach to it. That really, that the process of integrating people of different racial groups is a broader one. And so that may be the task that they couldn't do because it wasn't part of the language of their time. But it may be part of the task of our time, is to try to translate those sort of international norms we've accepted into our system under our Constitution in a way that vindicates those obligations that the United States has accepted. So we started with oppression, told you a lot of stories in different cases of sort of a very difficult period, and finished up with trying to give you just a little hint of that international stuff. I encourage you to study international law. There's a lot going on there. And I thank you for your time and your patience with me.